I mentioned this story in a comment on another post, and thought I might as well add in the details and make it my first post to this subreddit. This takes place in a fairly large city roughly 8 or so years ago. I'm a female, and at the time I was around my mid-20s. There used to be this gay bar that did goth nights every Saturday night. I would head out there fairly often with my friends. This night there was a group of about 5 of us that went together. Plus, we always ran into more people we knew once we got there. At some point, I left my friends on the dance floor and went up to the bar to get another drink. It was pretty crowded, so the only place I could really squeeze into was right next to some guy on a bar stool at the very end of the counter. As I ordered my drink, he glanced over and said hello. He had a very interesting accent, so I asked him where he was from. He replied that he was originally from Ethiopia. We made some small talk as I was waiting for my drink, and I commented that I'd had a neighbor as a child that was from there as well. The exact details of the conversation are a bit hazy. It was years ago after all, and to be fair, I was not exactly paying super close attention at the time. This means I'm not exactly sure how the conversation steered in this direction, but I do remember these words snapping my brain's focus immediately back onto him. I killed people there. Oh, well, I awkwardly chuckled, thinking maybe this was just some weird drunk guy thinking he would say weird creepy things to the goth girl at the bar. Maybe it was his really bad attempt at flirting. My drink arrived and I remember stirring it and trying to ease my way out of the conversation, but I was still waiting for my change. So you used to kill people? He shook his head and replied very casually. No, I still do. Uh-huh. My change could not arrive fast enough. I tried another awkward laugh and made some snarky comment about how I was fat, and if he tried to kill me, I'd fight back and sit on him or something. I don't know. I really had no idea how to respond to this type of situation. Again, very casually, without any emotion in his voice, he replied, "There's no trying. If I decide to kill someone, I kill them." My change finally arrived and I took my drink, which I had not let leave my hand or my sight for an instant. I excused myself and headed back over to my friends on the dance floor. I watched as he turned his stool so he could keep a firm eye on me. He just sat there, slowly sipping his own drink, never looking away from me. Finally, at some point, I saw him put down his empty glass and move out the front door. I sighed in relief and continued to enjoy my night. Several hours later, the goth night was finally ending, and the next theme DJ was taking over. My friends and I were saying our goodbyes, and I started walking to the front door. I turned around to see the friend that had given me a ride was stuck in a conversation with another acquaintance, so I waited near the door just inside the building. That's when he grabbed me. The guy from the bar dragged me in further, into a dark corner out of the line of sight of the exit. I was in shock. I couldn't even make a sound at first as he pinned me to the wall. Face pressed against it, and he twisted one of my arms behind my back. It seemed like an eternity that he held me there, pushing himself up firmly behind me, almost like he was trying to hide me even further in the shadows. There were no lights near us, and no reason for anybody to walk this deep by the corner. Even if I yelled, I wasn't sure if anyone would hear me, since the DJ had just started up. Somehow, though, I managed to shove myself back against him once my fight instincts kicked in. In his surprise, his grip loosened just a bit, and the angle he held me at relaxed. I managed to slam my fist against his balls. I have no idea to this day how I actually bent myself around in just the right way, but he immediately doubled over, and I took off running. I grabbed my friend out of our conversation and breathlessly gave a Cliff Notes version of what happened as I dragged her to the back emergency exit. Before I could escape, I was stopped by security. He told me I couldn't go that way and had to leave through the front of the bar. I tried to explain to him that there was a guy up there that had tried to attack me, but he just wouldn't listen. Maybe he tuned it out or thought I was just some drunk girl. Thankfully though, my friend and I managed to get the attention of a few other people we knew and headed out the front as a big group. I didn't see the guy anywhere, but I was terrified of getting through the dark parking lot to the car. I just knew he could be out there, hiding somewhere. My friend and I ran as fast as we could, dove into the car, and she pulled out of the parking space before I could even get my seatbelt on. The creeper dude was nowhere to be seen. I checked the news the next day to see if there had been any other attacks or, God forbid, any murders in the area, but there was nothing. I don't really remember many of his features, what he was wearing, or even how he sounded like, but I will never forget the emotionless, blank, matter-of-fact way he stated that he killed people, and the way his dark eyes stared at me like I was prey. I never went back to that bar after. I want to preface this story by stating that I've had my fair share of encounters with creepy men. This situation, however, scared the life out of me. It was the first time I genuinely felt like my life was in danger. My husband and I had to drive 17 hours last week to North Carolina for a wedding. It was honestly an exhausting week, and we basically spent the entire time rushing from one family gathering to another. We were staying in a motel for the time we were there. We had already been at this motel for a few days by the time the day of the actual wedding rolled around, and the day of the wedding? It was quite hectic. We were rushing around everywhere, trying to get ready to leave for the venue. My husband got ready before me, so he could do some last-minute things before we had to leave. That left me all alone in our motel room to get ready before he returned. It was extremely, brutally hot outside, so I decided to do my hair and makeup in just my underwear so I wouldn't be sweating in my nice dress the entire time. The way this motel was laid out, the sink and mirror were in the general open area of the room, with the toilet and shower in another room. So anyone walking by our room window could see me standing at the mirror. I did, however, have the curtains completely drawn closed. These curtains were a bit sheer though, so you could technically see the shadow of someone walking by on the outside, or maybe they could see the silhouette of me inside the room. I was curling my hair in the mirror when I noticed the silhouette of a man walking by my room window. As he's passing by my window, I see him stop and start trying to look inside. At first, I thought it was my husband trying to see if I was ready, so I paid no mind to it. But the longer the guy stood there bobbing his head around trying to get a better look through the curtains, I began to realize it was not my husband. Obviously, why wouldn't he just come in if it was? Now I was starting to get a little bit freaked out. Before I could even do anything though, I watched as this guy started to go for my room door. My utter shock and horror came when he was actually able to open it and walked inside. Before my husband had left, he had forgotten to pull the door shut all the way until it clicked into the lock. He was very upset at himself when I told him this later. So now here I was, face to face with this man, in my underwear no less. He was at least 6 feet tall, just standing in my room staring at me. I thought to myself, this is it. He's going to attack you. That's a very scary realization to have. I also thought to myself, you're going to have to burn his eye sockets out with this curling iron if you want to survive. For a few seconds, probably only a second or two, but it felt much longer, he just stood there staring at me, like I was a piece of meat and he was starving, ready to pounce at me like prey. He then began to smile the most evil-looking toothy grin I've ever seen, and started mumbling something under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying completely, but I did make out the words "pretty lady" and "come here." I don't know if it was the fight or flight response, but I just suddenly got extremely pissed. I charged towards him, ready to strike him with my hot curling iron. I screamed as loud as I could, "Get the fuck out of here!" It must have startled him quite a bit, because he jumped back and out onto the balcony of the motel. I saw this as my chance, and I ran for the door. Luckily, I was able to get to the door and slam it shut right before he was about to make his second attempt at entering inside. I immediately collapsed onto the floor sobbing. I was literally too scared to move from that spot until my husband came back 15 minutes later. I told him the whole thing and he was very freaked out. He initially wanted to find the guy so he could beat the shit out of him, but I refused to let him leave my side. He must have apologized 1,000 times during the rest of our trip for not making sure the door was locked before leaving, but I told him that day was so rushed, and that whole trip really, that I could understand how it happened. We went to the motel management and told them the whole story. The police were obviously called and I gave them a description of the guy so they could see if it was someone who was staying in the motel. After going around to the few motel occupants, they said no one matched his description and concluded he was not staying there at the time. Obviously, we were late to the wedding that day, and the whole experience just kind of ruined what should have been a happy time. We planned on staying another day before our long drive home, but we honestly just both wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. We skipped most of the reception, went back to the motel, and packed up and left. I'm usually always so vigilant when locking my doors, especially when I'm home alone. Just goes to show you that all it takes is that one time you forget to check your locks for a certain unwanted guest to invite themselves inside. I'm really writing this out as a way to vent because I'm in a situation where I kind of feel really stuck. Any advice is appreciated, but I'm not sure there's anything that can be said that will actually help. I've tried just about everything, so I'm going to start from the beginning. This is a story 2 years in the making, so I'll try to be as thorough as possible. In 2019, I graduated with my master's degree and moved to a relatively rural area for my PhD. Thinking we'd make an investment, my dad and I purchased a house. The intent was to rent it out once I'd completed my PhD. This house was only a block away from a dive bar where my dad was able to make some pretty good friends. He introduced me to everyone, and everyone let me know that I would be so happy in my new house because my next door neighbor was the absolute nicest guy you could ever meet. So we met the neighbor, and he did seem nice enough. He suggested we exchange numbers, just in case I ever needed anything, and I thought that was a pretty good idea. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? A few days later, my dad left to go back to his home in another state, and I was left to my own devices. Literally the exact day he left, it started. My neighbor texted me while I was away and let me know he left a gift for me on my front porch. In this text exchange, he started using pet names like Sweetie and Cutie. I went home and he had left a hand-painted feeding dish for my cats in my mailbox. At this point though, I wasn't that alarmed. He was just being extra nice, I thought. The next day, he sent me more texts with pet names, and I took the opportunity to make sure he knew I was not interested in anything romantic. He replied back with some rambling text about how all a person ever needs is friends, and he would just like to be friends with me. After that, he would send me texts very frequently. Everything from inviting me fishing to telling me he left more gifts on my porch. I would often not reply or just tell him I was busy. I didn't mean to be rude, but I also had no interest in any sort of relationship with him other than neighborly. One night, I got a text from the manager of the bar down the street, letting me know that if my neighbor ever knocked on my door, I should not answer. She then told me that my neighbor had walked down to the bar with a hatchet and told the bartender he was hearing voices that got louder as he got closer to the bar. He'd threatened to kill someone with the hatchet if the voices didn't stop. They'd called the police and the police took the hatchet from him, but they made no arrest. The manager of the bar picked me up and I spent the night at her house. She told me that the police said my neighbor was on meth. After that, I tried to keep my distance even more, but things got even weirder. One day, I went out to my car to find a dead squirrel in my driveway. This squirrel had very clearly been run over and moved right in front of my driver's side door. I stepped over it, got in my car, and left. When I returned home, the squirrel was gone. Shortly thereafter, I received a text from my neighbor that said, "Someone or something put a dead squirrel in your driveway, you know. Don't worry, I moved it away for you." I felt this was a weird way to word this, and I suspect he's the one that placed it there in the first place. Another time, I walked out of my house to see he had placed an unspent shotgun shell on the bricks in front of his yard. He came out and told me it was to serve as a warning for anyone walking between our houses. For the next couple of months, I did my very best to avoid him. He would text me inviting me over, and I would come up with an excuse or just ignore him completely. I still wanted to remain cordial since he was my neighbor, but it was getting very annoying, and I was starting to get uncomfortable. He would text me as soon as I got home, telling me he was watching me come and go from my house. Around Halloween, he handcrafted a large basket and wrote, "Here lies the last son of a bitch who played mind games, November 2012. What the fuck? All this time still sending me these texts. Eventually, I got fed up and stopped responding completely. Less than 2 weeks after I did so, he threw a 50-pound flower pot at my front door. You know those big concrete planters? Yeah, one of those. I called the police, who advised me to get a stalking no-contact order. A few days later, I was watching TV when a notification popped up that my neighbor was trying to cast a video to my screen. I declined it twice and filed another report with the police. During this time, I did start the process of getting a stalking no-contact order. I saw 3 different victim advocates, who all told me different things. I went out of town for a conference, and during that time, someone attempted to break into my home. I had an ADT security system, so while they had not succeeded, I was made aware of the attempt. After the conference, I came home to the entire world shutting down because of COVID. I was trapped in my home 24/7, with my stalker neighbor next door. Luckily, court proceedings for protection orders didn't stop though. Right before court, he sent me a text telling me he was sorry for what he'd done. That he could tell when he'd seen me outside that he made me uncomfortable. Then he went on to tell me he could tell my hair has gotten longer, and I looked more beautiful than ever. I went to court and provided all of the evidence I had, the timeline of everything that had ever happened, the text he'd sent me asking if I wanted a massage, the text I sent him telling him the way he was speaking to me was inappropriate, the text saying he knew that he made me uncomfortable. I also told the judge I suspected he was the one who attempted to break into my house while I was out of town. The kicker is, he didn't deny any of it. Actually, he told the judge he took full accountability for everything. He said he was in recovery and was trying to turn over a new leaf. He didn't oppose the protection order at all, so in March 2020, I actually received the stalking no-contact order. Everything was pretty quiet for a while. I mean, he did some weird shit every now and then, but that's just because he was a weird guy. It wasn't anything that made me fear for my safety though. That is, until he got on drugs again. At this time, we found an unspent shotgun casing in my flower bed. It was consistent with the one he had previously used to send a warning. This occurred a couple months after I started dating my boyfriend, and I suspect it was a warning to him. After this, and for a variety of reasons, my boyfriend moved in with me. He moved in pretty quickly, but everything turned out fine. We're still together and as happy in our relationship as we can be. New Year's 2021. I was awoken suddenly by yelling. I turned on my security cameras and got footage of him sticking his head out his window, screaming obscenities at my bedroom window for 7 minutes. It doesn't sound like a long time, but when your stalker is screaming threats and obscenities, 7 minutes is quite a while. He even called me a harlot. He said happy fucking New Year, and he said he was going to blow up his house with his gas line. I called the police, who responded very quickly. They told me he never said my name, so they couldn't prove it was a violation of the protection order. The officer said, and I quote, "There's nothing illegal about yelling in your own house." They left without even speaking to him. All I could do at this point was do my best to avoid him. I parked on the street because my driveway was pretty close to his front porch. I got used to living with my curtains drawn. I always made sure my cameras were charged, all 5 of them. Yes, because of him, I spent over $1,000 on cameras. Every inch of my yard was covered. Since then, he's been seen by me and other neighbors, talking to people who aren't there, going outside and screaming nonsense. Things like, "I have Cheerios on my necklace," or "I'll shove my penis in your butt." I'm not even joking. This basically brings me to last week. In the morning, I was getting ready for the day when I heard a bunch of screaming. "Someone is gonna die over this sweatshirt." I turned on the cameras. I got footage of him walking around the alley behind my house, screaming. "Are you fucking proud? How about I get my shotgun and I'll get everybody all fired up?" I called the police. Once again, they didn't charge him with violation of the protection order. Instead, they gave him an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. The police just told me it seemed like he was off his medication again, and that was that. They left. Last night, I was awoken to hammering outside my window at 1 a.m. He was cutting down his privacy fence horizontally. I called the police for a noise complaint, and they just told him to stop. As I write this, he's outside continuing to horizontally cut down his privacy fence. That means the privacy fence only stands about 3 feet tall now. This was the one thing that made me feel relatively safe about hanging out in my backyard, and now that's gone. All of this is to say I'm fucking tired. I just want to live in a house where I can be sure that my neighbor won't try to murder me, where I can feel confident he's not going to try to break in. My boyfriend and I are trying to buy a house to move, but it's very difficult. I'm a PhD student, so I don't make very much money. Renting won't work because I have 4 cats plus my partner's cat and dog, although we have secured a place for those if necessary. And finding a place to rent with so many animals is difficult, if not impossible. I refuse to rehome them, so maybe it's partially my fault I'm stuck in this situation. My dad has agreed to co-sign on another mortgage, and I've gotten a second job. We should be able to save up enough money within a few months. But until then, I'm kinda stuck. I just don't know what else to do. I'm so tired and angry, so I figured I'd write this to vent. If you made it this far, thanks for reading at all. There's still so many different instances I've left out, but I'm just so exhausted that I can't tell them all. This happened 3 summers ago, but I remember the main events still. To preface this, I've been on a shocking amount of dates and put myself in many foolish situations in the past. I'm a female, and I was 25 at the time if that matters. It started on the Plenty of Fish app. I came across this really cute guy. He was my type physically, kind of nerdy looking. On his profile, he had very adventurous photos of him hiking and traveling. He seemed really exciting to get to know. Once he saw I looked at his profile, he sent me a message right away. We flirted a bit back and forth and exchanged numbers, even though he lived about an hour away. He said on the app he'd never been to my city and didn't plan on it either, so we probably would never meet. I respected his honesty. I really don't like wasting my time. One day, shortly after meeting him online, he texted me quite randomly, saying he was in town on some work thing and invited me to a bar he was at. I decided to meet up with him since I was already in the area. He said he would pick me up. I was dumb and agreed, even though it was just over 4 blocks away. It took him way longer than it should have to get me. And honestly, I don't think he ever really was actually at that bar. Once in his car, I noticed it was a rental as well, and it seemed like he had just gotten his license because he was a very terrible driver. After driving in circles for quite a while, he told me to pick a place, but not in the area because parking was impossible. I picked a place about 15 minutes away by car with plenty of parking around. It was also a very busy place though, since I was with a stranger. Once there, he started pressuring me to drink. He was very insistent. I'm not a huge drinker, but I do enjoy pub-style bars. I caved and had a drink, and was again pressured to have another. He was very pushy, and seemed really irate that I wasn't going for it. Usually I'd end a date pretty quickly if being mistreated, but he became charming enough to keep me there, at least until we were done with this date. I saw an old acquaintance happen to be at the bar and wanted my date to know I knew him. In my head, I think I wanted my date to know that someone could identify him. I'm not a paranoid person, but my subconscious was on alert. After an hour of talking in the bar, I told him I was about ready to get home now. He insisted we go across the road to get coffee though. This seemed quite strange to me. Neither of us had had much to drink, and we didn't really need to sober up. Coffee seemed like an odd choice anyway. I decided to entertain him a bit longer though. Once there, we sipped on our drinks. He told me he had rented a beautiful Airbnb in a nearby neighborhood that was more out of the city and into the country area. He told me he had it all to himself, and he invited me, going on and on about how beautiful it was. I kept politely saying no and throwing around different excuses, which he would counter with a reason for me to come. With no intention of going, I agreed, but only if he would drive me home to get overnight things. I felt like he was not going to let me say no. He seemed satisfied enough with that answer, so we headed out to grab the stuff. While driving in the direction of my place, he said instead he would stop at a 7-Eleven and grab me travel-sized toiletries so I wouldn't need to get anything at all. I felt panicked because this was not according to plan. Something about him was starting to seem off, and I felt stupid for even getting back into his car to begin with. He turned this car, and then we started heading toward this more country area. Literally, there aren't any 7-Elevens or open stores this far in the middle of nowhere. I mentioned that I was actually thinking I'd prefer to not stay with him after all, and asked instead to be brought home. He then said something that made me completely nervous to be around him any further. He told me he was sharing the Airbnb with the owners and said they were really fun and sweet. They always drink and play games together. But he had just said that he had the place all to himself. I knew I didn't want to make it obvious that I was catching on to his lie, so I went along with it and said, "Oh, I have to wear my cute fluffy overnight PJs instead of my date dress. It'll be way more comfy and fun that way." I spewed off a bunch of other random things as well. I mentioned I also need my medication and absolutely could not miss a dose. Surprisingly, he actually turned around, and as we drove back into the city, I felt a bit more calm. I definitely did not feel safe yet though. Finally, we got close to my place. I had no intention though of letting him get close enough to actually know where I lived. He was mentioning that he was going to come up to my apartment once we got there, and that was just a huge hell no. I didn't know what I would do, but I looked for an opportunity to get out of the situation, knowing he could just turn around and take me somewhere private in a matter of minutes if he wanted. Luckily, we arrived to a stop sign where people were crossing across the crosswalk. Thank God. I quickly but calmly got out of the car while it was stopped and said I had a headache. I told him I'd text him later and closed the car door. Then I walked through a public park which was beside a building that his car wouldn't be able to drive into. I looked back to make sure he wasn't getting out and following me, and I could see him staring at me. His eyes were so furious I have chills just thinking about it. Within the hour, he had already blocked me on Plenty of Fish. Looking back, I think he possibly wanted to get me that coffee to put something in it while I wasn't looking. I think he also told me on Plenty of Fish that we wouldn't ever meet to cover his ass when he did something. I know he did not have good intentions with me. Since then though, I have met my fiancé on Plenty of Fish and was super careful about dating up until then, making sure the first few dates were very public and arranging my own transportation from then on.